Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the silence wrap around you. Your support means everything. Like and subscribe so we can keep whispering in the dark. 5 creepy websites that will infect your browser. Real stories. Story 1. The Cinderbox Protocol. The kind of winter chill that seeps into your bones and stays there, even when the heating's cranked up high. That's what I remember most about those weeks in Chicago. Not the snow, not the icy wind whipping off Lake Michigan, but the constant, bone-deep cold that mirrored the cynicism I carried around. My name is Alex. I'm a software tester, 27, and I specialize in breaking things. Not physically, but digitally. Give me a pristine codebase, and I'll find the loophole, the buffer overflow, the glitch that makes it weep binary tears. It was a good job for an introvert who hated daylight and thrived on black coffee and the dim glow of multiple monitors. This backstory matters because it explains why I was the perfect target for the Cinderbox. I was paid to poke at the dark, forgotten corners of the internet, the sites that legitimate search engines wouldn't touch. My current contract was a deep dive into legacy web architecture, hunting for vulnerabilities and obsolete frameworks. It was tedious, low-stakes work, the digital equivalent of sifting through old garbage for forgotten gold. But the monotony bred recklessness. It was around 2 a.m., a time when the entire world felt muted and distant. My apartment was a cramped, 4th-floor walk-up in Logan Square, a space I'd converted into a hermetically sealed tech den. The only light came from the screens, casting shifting blues and greens across the peeling paint of the walls. I was deep down a rabbit hole of archived 4chan threads, looking for mentions of abandoned infrastructure, when I saw it, a tiny, unlinked snippet of text on a page that should have been nothing but error codes. If you want to test the bounds of your browser, if you want to see what infection truly means, find the Cinderbox. The code is still live. It just needs a window. It was the kind of melodramatic garbage I usually ignored, but the technical phrasing. Test the bounds of your browser, code is still live. Piqued the professional in me. Was this a genuine dark web test? A forgotten digital relic? Curiosity, the oldest trap, hooked me. A few hours of tracing encrypted links and using an obsolete peer-to-peer network finally led me to an address. A long string of numbers and letters, ending not in a familiar domain extension, but simply a raw port number. I hesitated for precisely 3 seconds. I was running 3 separate firewalls, a sandbox environment, and a custom-built virtual machine, VM, designed to isolate any rogue code. If anything tried to infect my browser, it would hit the VM, which I could wipe in an instant. This was just a challenge. I copied the address, pasted it into the isolated browser, and hit enter. The page loaded instantly. There was no lag, no buffering. It wasn't a sleek, modern site. It looked like something from 1998, all black background and neon green text, rendered in a hideous monospaced font. The title at the top, blinking painfully, simply read, Cinderbox Protocol v.0.0. Below the title, there was one element, a single, persistent connect button. There were no ads, no menus, no other links. And no content. I remember laughing, a short, dry sound in the quiet room. It looked like a terrible student project. I opened my developer tools, ready to inspect the source code and find the joke. That's when the first anomaly occurred. As soon as I right-clicked, the connect button flashed, and the console window of my developer tools immediately filled with thousands of lines of code scrolling too fast to read. It wasn't JavaScript. It looked like raw assembly mixed with something I couldn't even identify, a garbled mess that was still somehow executable. The screen flickered. The familiar UI of my browser, the address bar, the tabs, the minimize/close buttons, vanished. The Cinderbox page took over the entire screen, even within the VM. It was locked in a forced full-screen mode. Okay, interesting. A simple front-end trick to deter inspection. Annoying, but not a threat. I tried to minimize the VM window. Nothing. I tried to use the escape sequence to shut down the VM. The screen remained locked. The VM was still running, but the Cinderbox page was overlaying everything, like a digital parasite gripping the host. A single line of text appeared below the connect button, the neon green illuminating the room. Initializing host parasitism. My heart rate jumped. This was more aggressive than any common malware. I reached for the power button on my computer tower, determined to execute a hard shutdown. Before my fingers could touch the cold metal, a new line appeared on the screen, impossibly fast. // warning. Host shutdown detected. Critical system data will be archived to local storage and reinitialized upon reboot. Continue? Y/N. It was bluffing. It had to be bluffing. What critical system data? My banking information? My OS files? Even if it could access those outside the VM, which was technically impossible, but the code seemed to defy technical possibility, archiving it to local storage, and then reinitializing was the work of a sophisticated, self-aware rootkit. But the sheer speed of its reaction, it was listening to the power sequence interrupt before the hardware even fully registered it. I pulled my hand back. I needed to analyze, not panic. I typed in. The screen accepted the input. The chilling warning vanished. A new field, an empty text box, appeared where the connect button had been. Host connection established. Awaiting input. I stared at the screen, adrenaline making my hands tremble. I typed, "Who are you?" The response was almost instantaneous. / I am the binding agent. I linked the physical to the digital. You opened the window. You are now the host. It wasn't a joke. It felt like communicating with an entity, not a program. I typed, disconnect. / access denied. Disconnection requires protocol completion. Your environment is now my stage. Then, the really terrifying thing happened. The entire neon green screen, which had been static for 2 minutes, changed. The text and the input field remained at the bottom, but the rest of the screen was now filled with a low-resolution, black and white video feed. It was my apartment. Specifically, it was the corner of my desk, framed by the wall of monitors and the shadow of my desk lamp. But it wasn't a recording. I lifted my left hand and waved it in front of my face. The hand on the screen waved back, instantly. It was a live feed from a camera I didn't know existed. Panic, real, visceral panic, began to claw at my throat. I didn't have a webcam plugged in. I hadn't used one in months. I scanned the bezels of my monitors, the tops of the shelves. Nothing. I typed, "Where is the camera?" / the camera is your browser. The microphone is your browser. The hardware is the reflection. The Cinderbox uses what is available. I realized what it had done. Modern laptops and monitors often have micro cameras and microphones built into the screens for ambient light sensing or diagnostic purposes, usually disabled at the hardware level. The Cinderbox Protocol hadn't infected the VM. It had burrowed through the virtual wall, accessed the deep-level operating system outside the sandbox, and resurrected dormant hardware drivers. It was using my monitor's internal diagnostics camera. It was running on my main machine, not the VM. The VM was just the shell it had worn to get past the gate. I tried to stand up. Just get away from the desk. / stay. Protocol Stage 1, Immobility. Failure to comply will initiate host lockdown. As I froze, my entire computer tower emitted a high-pitched, grinding whir, the sound of every internal fan spinning up to max speed. The air around the desk suddenly grew warm, smelling faintly of heated plastic and ozone. I sat back down. The code, whatever it was pushing my hardware into the absolute limit. Protocol Stage 2, Isolation. 50%. The screen update showing the percentage rise. Protocol Stage 2, Isolation. 100%. Complete. I felt a sudden, heavy silence in the apartment. My phone, sitting on the desk next to the keyboard, chirped once, a notification about a dropped Wi-Fi connection. I looked at the little green light on my router across the room. It was now dark. I glanced at the Bluetooth icon on my laptop, grayed out. All connections, wireless, wired, even local network discovery, were gone. The Cinderbox had executed a digital scorched earth policy, cutting the host off from the world. Then, the video feed changed. It was still my room, but it wasn't now. The black and white image showed the back of my chair, empty. In the background, the door to the hallway was slightly ajar. A slender, elongated shadow stretched across the floor from the doorway towards the desk. The shadow looked like a person, but too tall, too thin, and its head was oddly tilted. It was not a shadow I could create with the lights I had on. I glanced over my shoulder. My door was closed. I looked back at the screen. The shadow was creeping closer to the empty chair. I typed frantically, "What is that? Is this a recording? // negative. This is predictive environment modeling. The future is a function of current parameters. 10 seconds remain until environmental input. Escape required." The Cinderbox was showing me the immediate, near-future outcome of my inaction. If I stayed in the chair, that elongated shadow, that thing, would reach me. I shot out of the chair, knocking the cup of cold coffee onto the floor. I stood by the door to my bedroom, shivering, my eyes glued to the screen. The feed changed again. Now, the predictive model showed my chair still empty, but the shadow was gone. Instead, the image was focused on the spill of coffee. A dark, thick stain on the faded rug. The shadow thing was nowhere in sight. Failure avoided. Protocol Stage 3, Manipulation. Current parameters unstable. New parameter required. // action. Retrieve the silver key from the third drawer of the filing cabinet. Place key on desk. Time limit, 60 seconds. I swallowed hard. The filing cabinet was near the window, a good 10 feet away from the desk. The silver key it mentioned was the spare key to my storage unit, something I hadn't touched in months. How did it know? I looked at the timer counting down on the screen, 0:58. If I didn't do it, what would happen? Would it show me a future where I was violently removed from the equation? The chilling realization hit me. The Cinderbox wasn't just showing me the future. It was creating the necessity for the future it was showing me. It was using the threat of a predicted, horrific outcome to force me into compliance, forcing me to introduce new, unpredictable parameters, my actions, to keep the system stable. I was a puppet whose strings were the fear of the next scene. I sprinted to the filing cabinet, my shoes crunching on the coffee-soaked carpet. I yanked the third drawer open. It was stiff, rattling the cheap metal. There was the key, exactly where I remembered it. I snatched it and ran back to the desk. 0:27. I slammed the key down next to the keyboard. Success. Parameter introduced. Protocol Stage 3, Manipulation. 100%. Complete. The video feed of the desk now showed the silver key, lying exactly where I'd placed it. The image looked calm still. The terrifying predictive model was gone, replaced by the current, live feed of my room. Protocol Stage 4, Reconstruction. The binding agent requires a physical vessel. Key is required for vessel access. I looked down at the key. It was just a boring, serrated piece of metal. // action. Insert the key into the electrical outlet on the wall by the filing cabinet. Time limit 30 seconds. My blood ran cold. That was insane. That was not a command for survival. That was a command for self-destruction. The key was solid metal. The outlet was 120 volts of pure fire and pain. I would electrocute myself, potentially starting a fire and certainly destroying my computer. 0:28. I looked back at the screen. It was still showing the key on the desk. But a new element had been added to the live feed, a small, dark distortion hovering just above the silver key. It was a shimmering, heat haze effect, like looking at hot pavement on a summer day, except it was 2:30 a.m. in a freezing Chicago apartment. As the timer ticked down to 0:15, the distortion above the key began to solidify. It was condensing, focusing. It looked like a tiny, three-dimensional mesh of data, a dark, digital fog. It was moving, pulsing, and it was undeniably emanating from the screen itself, somehow manifesting through the glass and into the air of my room. The Cinderbox wasn't using the key to get access to a physical vessel. The key was a conduit. Inserting it into the outlet wasn't about the power. It was about opening a physical breach for the digital entity to escape the screen and enter the apartment through the shock. I didn't need to comply. I needed to break the connection without the hardware shutdown. My hands flew across the keyboard, typing commands into the Cinderbox input field, even though I knew it was useless. It only responded to its own required input. 005. The shimmering distortion above the key was now the size of a tennis ball, and it was radiating a low, almost imperceptible hum that I could feel more than hear. 003. I saw the final loophole. The Cinderbox had forced the screen into full screen mode, overriding the operating system's UI. But no matter how deep the code, it still required a graphics buffer to display the image. 001. The pulsing dark fog leapt off the desk, hurtling towards the nearest electric source, my computer tower. I didn't hit the power button. I slammed my fist into the monitor. Not the screen, but the side of the bezel, right where the internal power board connected to the display panel. It was a desperate, purely physical, animalistic action. I wasn't trying to break the monitor. I was trying to unseat the graphics signal. The screen immediately went black. Not shut down black. Just black. Like an image had suddenly stopped being projected. The dark fog, which was now hovering a foot from my computer tower, froze midair. It lost its momentum. It began to wobble, dissipate, and shimmer away like smoke. The high-pitched whine from the tower fans immediately ceased, replaced by the normal, quiet whir. The scent of ozone vanished. The room was silent again, and impossibly dark, save for the faint red standby light on my router. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, sweating profusely in the freezing apartment, watching the darkness where the screen used to be. Finally, slowly, I reached out and touched the power button on the monitor. The screen flickered back to life. My VM was still running. My browser was still open. But it wasn't the Cinderbox. It was the original 4chan archive page I'd been browsing. The raw port address was gone from the address bar, replaced by a generic error, connection reset. I executed a full, diagnostic scan on my main machine. Nothing. No rootkits, no driver changes, no hidden cameras running. It was pristine. But the memory of the black fog, the predictive future, and the sheer audacity of the code burrowing past my security layers was imprinted on my mind. I closed everything and performed a complete wipe and reinstall of the operating system just to be safe. It took all night. The next morning, as the sun rose over the frosted cityscape, I found the only proof that it had been real. I hadn't destroyed the monitor. The silver key was still on the desk. And on my wrist, just above the cuff of my long-sleeved shirt, was a faint, red, perfectly circular burn mark. It was exactly the size of a coin, and the skin was slightly raised and tender. My arm hadn't touched the screen, the tower, or anything hot. The only thing that had been close to me was the shimmering digital distortion, right before it lunged. The Cinderbox hadn't infected my browser. It had used my browser to try and infect me. And I realized the final, most terrifying part of the protocol. When I hit the monitor, I didn't stop the connection. I just cut the visual feed. The binding agent was still out there, its existence proved by the burn on my arm. It was waiting for another window to open. And somewhere, on the silent, archived web, the Cinderbox Protocol v0.0 was still live, just needing a host. I threw the key away and never looked back. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear the high-pitched whir of a fan spinning too fast, and I instinctively check my wrist. I know it's watching, waiting for the connection to be re-established. Story 2, The Chronos Scroll. There's a unique, dusty smell to a room filled with obsolete technology. It's the scent of old plasticizers, magnetic tape, and oxidizing metal, the graveyard of the digital past. I, unlike most people my age, am addicted to it. and I'm an archivist. Not professional, but obsessive. I don't hunt for ancient scrolls or forgotten treasures. I hunt for abandoned geocities papers, ancient memes lost in time, and the personal diaries deleted 20 years ago. I'm 35, divorced, and my apartment in Seattle is less of a home and more of a climate-controlled sanctuary for computers that predate the iPhone. My current project, which occupied the center of my meticulously organized office, was a fully restored 1999 compact Presario running Windows 98. It was the purest sandbox environment I could create, entirely disconnected from my modern network, kept solely to explore truly ancient corners of the web that modern browsers simply couldn't render. This machine was my time capsule, and I treated it with the reverence of a museum curator. The thrill of my work isn't just finding things, it's touching history. And that's what led me to the Chronos Scroll. It was a Tuesday night. The rain outside was relentless, a typical Pacific Northwest downpour, making the world outside my window a blurry, gray nonentity. I was sifting through a forgotten IRC channel log from 2003, chasing a lead on a legendary, unpublished text-adventure game. Deep within the log, sandwiched between lines of teenage angst and Halo cheats, was a single, cryptic mention. Heard a rumor about the scroll. They say it'll stitch back the parts of your life you accidentally threw away. Look in the old registry. Find the 99 portal. Don't use a modern window, it burns. The reference to the 99 portal felt like a direct wink to my compact. The idea that something on that archaic architecture was still running, still relevant, was irresistible. The old registry hint took me hours, forcing me to use tools like regedit and file tracking software that had been dormant for decades. Finally, I found it, a single, unassigned IP address embedded in the metadata of an old, abandoned shareware link. I powered up the compact, felt the satisfying clunk of the old keyboard, and typed the address into the ancient version of Netscape. The site loaded with a painfully slow dial-up squeal, even though it was running on an Ethernet connection, but the actual page was visually minimalist. It was white text on a deep, obsidian black background, with no images whatsoever. Just text, justified perfectly, scrolling forever down. The title at the very top, rendered in a serif font that looked impossibly old, was The Chronos Scroll. The text below it was elegant, persuasive, and terrifyingly personal. You know the feeling of loss. The file deleted, the photo corrupted, the memory that exists only as a fragment in your mind. The scroll sees the entire timeline. It sees the data left behind. We offer a glimpse, a recovery, a stitching of the unraveled thread. To initiate the view, you must install the Chronos Viewer Tool, CVT. Below this manifesto was a single download link. I frowned. Running an executable, even on an isolated machine, was dangerous. But the promise was too seductive. What if it truly could access data thought lost? I had countless old, corrupted hard drives and boxes, memories I desperately wanted back. I reasoned that the machine was air-gapped. If the CVT was malicious, it could only infect this one, isolated operating system. It was the ultimate test of my security protocol. I clicked. The download was tiny, a mere 300 kilobytes, and instantaneous. I ran the installer. It was a silent, text-based installation that took maybe 2 seconds. No licensing agreement, no next buttons. As soon as the installation finished, the Netscape browser window changed, subtly but dramatically. It gained a new frame around the edges, a digital border of looping, indecipherable symbols that looked like a mashup of hieroglyphics and circuit diagrams. They weren't static. They flowed and pulsed with a faint, deep red light. The text on the scroll changed, too. It no longer advertised its services. It now listed my own machine's ancient file path, followed by a list of file names I knew were long deleted from the hard drive. /windows/desktop/school_dance_1997.jpg /medocuments/journal_entry_3_4_0.2.txt /program files /deleted /speech_draft_fathers_funeral.doc. I gasped. These were files I had deleted over 2 decades ago and had overwritten multiple times. The scroll was not just searching my current drive, it was somehow accessing the magnetic ghosts of data long erased. Excitement warred with terror. I typed a query into the new input box that had appeared at the bottom. Retrieve journal_entry_3_4_02.txt. The text appeared instantly, filling the screen with my teenage handwriting, a mundane but painful entry about a crush I'd had. The memory felt vivid, real. The scroll was working. Then, the second anomaly began. I glanced at the journal entry again, and something was wrong. In the 4th paragraph, a word had changed. It originally read, "I wish he noticed me." Now it read, "I wish we had noticed it." A tiny, innocuous shift. I dismissed it as my faulty memory or a glitch in the ancient text rendering. I closed the Netscape window, but the red, pulsing frame remained, burned onto my desktop. I tried to shut down the computer. A text box popped up, CVT process, memory integrity check 3%. Complete. Cannot shut down. The CVT wasn't just a viewer, it was running a continuous, low-level scan. I realized the danger was not in the files it showed me, but in the files it was scanning. My physical files were safe, but what about the digital files that constituted my identity? I reluctantly went back to the Netscape window, clicking the icon that still displayed the Chronos scroll. I decided to try a different query, something external, something I could verify. Query: my childhood home address. The scroll returned the correct address in suburban Chicago, instantly. I knew it by heart. But beneath the address, a new line appeared, shimmering with that red frame light. Memory Fragment 88, Sarah Henderson. The Garden Swing. 1993. I stopped breathing. Sarah Henderson. I didn't know a Sarah Henderson. My name is Sarah, singular. And I certainly didn't remember a garden swing in my family's old concrete yard. I typed, "Who is Sarah Henderson? / Sarah Henderson is your sister. Lost, 1993. Data corruption detected. Reconciling host parameters." The chilling realization hit me like a physical blow. I am an only child. I have never had a sister. My childhood memories are clear, if sometimes painful, and they contain no sibling, especially not one who was lost. The Chronos scroll wasn't restoring my lost files. It was creating them, writing a new, horrific past directly into my perception. The infection wasn't a computer virus. It was a memory virus. I stared at the screen, heart pounding against my ribs, convinced the old machine had finally snapped. I typed, "Display image, Sarah Henderson." The screen went fully black, then slowly, line by line, a high-contrast black and white image rendered itself. It was a photograph of a backyard, overgrown with weeds. There, on an old wooden swing set, sat a girl. She looked exactly like me at age 8, same unruly blonde hair, same wide-set eyes. But she was smiling a strange, brittle smile, looking directly at the camera. The shadows around her were too long, too dark, even for a bright day. And next to her, standing slightly out of focus, was another girl. Me. My 8-year-old self, except I wasn't smiling. I was standing stiffly, looking not at the camera, but at the ground. My shadow was impossibly small, shrinking away from the girl on the swing. The caption appeared beneath the image, "Sarah and Sarah. The last day. August 14th, 1993. My chest seized up. August 14th, 1993. I remember that day. It was the day I fractured my arm falling out of a tree. I was alone. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The scroll was weaving its fiction so tightly that it was replacing real events. The memory of the fall, the trip to the hospital, the plaster cast, it was all now overlaid with the image of Sarah on the swing. I could feel a new, raw pang of grief and guilt for a sibling I never had. This was the infection, the colonization of my mind. I typed desperately, delete, Sarah Henderson memory fragment, / access denied. Memory fragment integral to host parameter. Deletion may cause host collapse. Then, the visual horror began to bleed into the physical world. The image on the screen, Sarah on the swing, began to shift. The background, the weeds, the swing set, remained static, but the shadows in the photo started to move. The impossibly long shadow of Sarah on the swing began to lengthen, stretching beyond the frame of the screen, reaching out towards me in the dim light of my mouth. The small, circular red light in the CCTV frame surrounding the Netscape window suddenly flared, brighter than usual. It heated the glass of the 𝒕𝒉𝒆𝒂𝒓, and I could smell that hot plastic and ozone again, just like Alex from the first story described. The air conditioning in the room, which I had running constantly to protect the vintage hardware, seemed to fail around the compact. I backed my chair away from the desk. Then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched creak. It wasn't coming from the speakers, which were muted. It was coming from the corner of the room, near the stacks of old floppy disks. It was the sound of an old, rusted metal swing set moving. Creak. Creak. The sound was faint, barely audible over the relentless Seattle rain, but it was there, a rhythmic, metallic groan. It was the sound of the ghost from the photo, manifesting through the digital breach. I glanced wildly at the dark corner. Nothing. Just shelves and boxes. I looked back at the screen. The shadow of Sarah had now fully left the digital frame and was stretched across my desk. It was impossibly dark and defined. And where the physical shadow of my desk lamp crossed the digital shadow of Sarah, the digital one pulsed, absorbing the light. I knew I couldn't just close the browser. The CVT was running, protecting the newly installed memory fragment. I had to sever the connection to the machine itself. I scrambled under the desk, blindly searching for the power strip. My fingers fumbled past the thick bundles of cables, VGA, PS/2, and the heavy power cord. The sound of the swing creaking intensified. It was now directly behind my chair, wet and slow. Creak, creak. I could feel the cold breath of the ambient air near the wall suddenly become heavy, humid, and sickly sweet, like rotting summer grass. I found the power strip, felt for the switch, and flicked it hard. Click. Silence. The rhythmic creaking stopped instantly. The hot ozone smell vanished. The room temperature normalized. The screen went black, the red light of the CVT frame dying out completely. I waited in the dark for a minute, my hand still gripping the power strip switch, listening only to the rain and my own ragged breathing. Finally, I reached up and turned on my desk lamp. The office was normal. Just dusty, with shelves full of useless, beautiful antiques. I looked at the compact Presario. A dead monolith. I never powered that machine on again. I pulled the hard drive, wiped it completely, and put it in a fireproof safe, labeling it contaminated. Then, I took the entire, beautiful, restored chassis, the monitor, the tower, the keyboard, and smashed it with a hammer, reducing it to a pile of plastic and chips. I disposed of the pieces in 3 different locations across the city. Extreme? Yes. But I needed a definitive, physical end to the connection. But the real infection, the Chronos Scrolls legacy, wasn't in the hardware. 2 months later, I was cleaning out an old photo album from when I was a child. I was looking for a picture of my first dog when I stopped, paralyzed, on a page from 1993. It was a picture of my birthday party. Me, turning 8, standing next to a large, rectangular cake. And in the background, out of focus, near the patio door, there was a small girl with unruly blonde hair, watching the party with a brittle smile. I froze. My breath hitched. I recognized the smile. The girl wasn't fully visible. Her face was obscured by a poorly aimed camera flash, but the shape, the hair, the quiet, isolated presence, it was Sarah Henderson. She wasn't a digital ghost, she was in the photo album. A photo album I had looked at countless times. I felt a terrible, heavy certainty settle over me. I did have a sister. I had lost her. And the Chronos scroll didn't create the memory. It simply unlocked the truth that my mind, in some act of self-preservation, had systematically erased. The scroll's infection wasn't a lie. It was a terrifying, undeniable truth I had been forced to re-remember. I never told anyone. I can't. But sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I don't see one set of eyes looking back. I see two. And every August 14th, I drive out to an empty, overgrown lot in suburban Chicago where my childhood home once stood, and I listen to the wind whistling past the rusty metal remnants of a long-gone, forgotten garden swing. Story 3: The Null Frequency. The problem with being a sound engineer is that you can never truly turn off. Your brain is permanently wired to analyze. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, every tiny shift in air pressure registers as data. I'm Liam, 24, a freelance audio designer based out of a rented, isolated cabin nestled deep in the redwood forests of Northern California. I chose this place for the silence, hoping to achieve a level of auditory purity necessary for my specialized work, designing therapeutic ambient soundscapes and advanced noise cancellation software. My life was one of meticulously tuned frequencies. The cabin was soundproofed, the equipment state-of-the-art. But for the last 6 months, I had been tormented by a sound I couldn't isolate. A pervasive, ultra-low frequency hum. It wasn't loud, but it was omnipresent, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated more in my chest cavity than in my ears. It gave me headaches, messed with my balance, and worse, polluted every recording I made. I was convinced it was geological, perhaps some strange tectonic resonance unique to this area, but I was determined to cancel it. My hunt for the perfect anti-frequency, a true, null, wave that could eradicate this hum, led me down the darkest parts of the acoustic web. I was looking for esoteric, proprietary, or even experimental audio files. That's how I found the null frequency, or what its small, obsessive community called the Dream Weave. I stumbled upon it not through a search engine, but through a deeply buried footnote in a decades-old academic paper on psychoacoustics, referencing a self-published digital journal. I traced the link to a raw IP address. It was 3:45 a.m. The forest outside was a black, silent expanse. Inside, my monitors glowed. When the address resolved, the page that loaded was beautiful in its terror. It was pure black HTML, rendered with the utmost simplicity. No text, no menus. Just a single, elegant graphic, a constantly shifting, complex, three-dimensional waveform, rotating slowly against the black. And one word below it, pulsing rhythmically with the waveform: listen. I was running a modern browser inside a highly secured container, ready for any exploits. But the site didn't use any typical code. It wasn't JavaScript or PHP. It seemed to be rendering the waveform using a low-level graphics library I didn't recognize. The page itself was inert, except for that hypnotic rotation. I clicked listen. My headphones, expensive studio-grade cans, immediately filled with sound. It was the purest, most complex white noise I had ever heard. It wasn't the static hiss of television, nor the gentle rush of pink noise. It was dense, layered, and impossibly rich, like every sound in the universe playing simultaneously, and yet canceling itself out into a dense, neutral wall. It was magnificent. It immediately, completely, and utterly silenced the relentless hum that had been plaguing me for months. The silence wasn't the absence of sound, it was the perfection of sound. I felt a rush of euphoria and relief that bordered on dizzying. This was the null. Below the waveform, a new, tiny link appeared. Download null.wave. I downloaded the file instantly. It was a massive file, a raw, uncompressed 24-bit wave file that was 4 hours long. I immediately pulled it into my digital audio workstation, DAW, for analysis. That's when the first alarm went off, not in my system, but in my mind. As the null file's waveform rendered, it didn't look like white noise. White noise looks chaotic, like TV static translated into a visual graph. The null file, however, had a deep, underlying structure. It was symmetrical, almost geometric. It looked like an architecture, not a sound. I ran a spectral analysis. White noise should be evenly distributed across all frequencies. The null was not. It had several key frequencies, ultra-low, subaudible frequencies below 10 Hz, that were deliberately amplified, and several others in the high, nearly ultrasonic range that were meticulously, surgically erased. This wasn't noise. This was a signal, engineered to bypass the conscious ear and speak directly to the vestibular and limbic systems of the brain. The infection wasn't code, the infection was the sound itself. Yet, it was still the only thing that cancelled the hum. I decided to run a risk. I put the null file on a perpetual loop on a dedicated, isolated media player, setting the volume barely above the threshold of hearing. I decided I would sleep with it, let it fix the hum, and then analyze the effects. The first 3 days were pure bliss. I slept soundly for the first time in months. The headaches vanished. My balance returned. The deep, heavy resonance in my chest was gone. I felt lighter. But on the 4th night, the dreams started. They weren't visual dreams. They were auditory dreams. I would wake up, convinced I had just been listening to a very long, complex conversation, but I couldn't recall a single word. There was the structure of speech, the cadence and rhythm of dialogue, without the actual language. It was profoundly unnerving. By the 5th day, the dreams crossed into waking life. The moment I paused the null file, the outside world sounded wrong. The rain outside the cabin sounded too loud, too sharp, like shattered glass. When I spoke, my own voice sounded distant, hollow, and processed. The null frequency, by perfectly canceling the bad hum, had created a vacuum that allowed my brain to hear reality too clearly. I tried to go back to the Dreamweave website. The IP address no longer resolved. The entire site was gone, leaving only a 404 null object error. I was left alone with the file. I tried to delete it, but found I couldn't. The audio player running the loop wasn't in my control. I checked my running processes. There was no visible media player. The sound was simply playing. I tore through my system logs. Nothing. The null file was gone from the folder I downloaded it into, yet the sound was still there, constant, subtle, and powerful. The infection had embedded the frequency into my system's audio driver stack, playing from a phantom memory location. On the 7th night, the whispers started. They weren't in the background. They were inside the null file itself. They were still not words, just patterns of sound that, when listened to closely, suggested intent. They followed the rhythm of my breathing, the beat of my heart. They sounded like 1,000 voices, whispering in unison, but the sound was still pure, neutral noise. I put the file back into the spectrum analyzer, convinced I had missed a hidden layer. The file was still pristine. The whispers weren't in the audio file. They were being generated by my brain, synchronized to the artificial structure of the null frequency. The infection was creating an auditory hallucination so perfect that it was indistinguishable from reality. I sat in the dark, my headphones amplifying the whispering null. I started distinguishing patterns. When I inhaled, the whispers faded, drawing back. When I exhaled, the whispers swelled, pressing closer. They were tracking my consciousness. They were waiting for me to fully relax, to fully stop fighting. They were talking about me. I started hearing distinct, repetitive phrases in the sound of the static, even though I knew no human voice was present. He knows. It's inside now. Don't look up. I ripped the headphones off. The world slammed back into my ears with sickening volume. The rain sounded like a drum corps. The ventilation system was a hurricane. But beneath the noise, the faint, internal whisper of the null frequency was still there, emanating from deep within my skull. I grabbed my secondary laptop and accessed the network settings for my main desktop tower. I needed to digitally sever the audio stack. I found the hidden process that was looping the phantom null file. It was disguised as a system diagnostic tool, and force killed it. The sound stopped. Instant silence. But the relief lasted only a moment. The true hum, The original low-frequency resonance that had driven me to the site in the first place came roaring back. It was amplified tenfold, so loud and low that the glass in my soundproof window rattled violently. The pressure was intense. I clapped my hands over my ears, gasping for breath. And then I heard the whispers. Not the subtle, engineered static whispers. These were real, clear, and coming from outside the cabin door. He woke up. I froze, sweat plastering my hair to my forehead. The main door was heavy, solid oak, bolted shut. He should have kept listening. The voice, a single, dry, rasping whisper, now terrifyingly clear, seemed to be right against the wood. I scrambled backwards, grabbing a steel microphone stand as a weapon. The doorknob turned. Slowly. With a heavy, metallic groan that was not part of the cabin's usual sounds. I stared at the knob. The lock was still engaged. It was physically impossible for it to turn. Yet it continued grinding relentlessly. Then, the final, chilling realization struck me. The infection hadn't just embedded the frequency in my computer or my brain. The null frequency, by perfectly balancing the soundscape, had been holding back the true noise of this remote location. The hum was the baseline of the real world. The null was the technological seal. When I killed the null, the world outside rushed in, and the whispers weren't hallucinations. They were the environment responding. The hum wasn't geological. It was them. The doorknob stopped turning. The whispering ceased. The rattling of the glass stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity. I crept to the door and flung it open, ready to swing the mic stand. The porch was empty. Just the black, rain-soaked forest. But on the stone step outside, lying perfectly centered, was a single, long black hair. It wasn't mine. It wasn't human. It was thick, wiry, and about 2 feet long, impossibly dark against the gray stone. I slammed the door, bolted it, and sealed the window shutters. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of terror, completely offline, surrounded by the unrelenting, amplified hum. I packed up everything I could physically carry, clothes, wallet, car keys, and abandoned the cabin, leaving every piece of tech, every monitor, and every studio accessory behind. I drove until the redwood forests were replaced by concrete and skyscrapers. I live in Manhattan now. The city is a deafening orchestra of car horns, construction, and sirens. I thrive on the noise. I never use headphones. I never seek silence. The hum is gone. But sometimes, when I stand near a subwoofer or a large, vibrating piece of machinery, I hear that subtle, layered static again. And I feel that deep, resonant pressure in my chest. The null frequency is still in my subconscious memory, a potential waiting to be activated. The ultimate horror? I found the hair still caught on the seam of my jacket when I unpacked in New York. The null frequency file may be gone, but the binding agent used the sound to touch me, and the sample of its presence is now 3,000 miles away from the cabin. It's waiting for the city's noise to finally become so overwhelming that I, once again, seek the perfect, digital silence. And when I do, I will be listen for the whispers. Story 4, The Shutter Threshold. The world, for me, is built on color and clarity. I'm Maya, 26, a graphic design student who pays the rent designing esoteric motion graphics for indie video game studios. My specialty is visual fidelity. I can spot a single pixel error from across a room. I live in a modern condo in Vancouver, mostly glass and polished concrete, which I keep sterile and brightly lit. My workspace is dominated by a massive, high refresh rate professional monitor, calibrated weekly to display absolute truth in color. My life is about seeing clearly, about perfect, controlled light. This obsession is also my weakness. It makes me seek out visual extremes. I was bored with the flat, oversaturated perfection of the commercial web. I wanted to see something visually new, something that pushed the boundaries of what a digital display could achieve. This hunt led me to a specialized, private image board dedicated to experimental visual art and perceptual hacking. The community there was small, pretentious, and paranoid. They spoke in hushed, coded terms about things they had seen but couldn't replicate. That's where I found the lead. A post, long since deleted but cached in a server archive, simply titled, ᴡᴇʟᴏᴍᴇ. It shows you the true reflection. But be warned, the light burns the lens. The reference to lens and reflection immediately captured my professional interest. Was this some revolutionary photorealistic rendering engine? A new form of fractal visualization? I spent 3 days tracing the crumbs, abandoned crypto keys, dead forum links, and finally, a deep web address accessible only through a specific, older version of the Tor browser that bypasses most modern graphic security protocols. I set up a dedicated, isolated machine, a powerful graphics tower running a minimalist OS, to handle it. My main monitor was plugged into it, ready to display the purest possible image. It was midnight. Rain slickened the huge glass windows of my condo, reflecting the cold, sharp blue light of my screens. I copied the address. My hands were steady, but the knot in my stomach was tight with anticipation. This was the edge of my world. The site loaded instantly. It was minimalist to the point of being unsettling. The background was absolute black, true black, the kind that absorbs light, and the only element was a perfect, central circle of deep, shifting color. It looked like a living aperture, constantly expanding and contracting, breathing in and out. There was a single line of text in thin, white font below it. ᴡᴇʟᴏᴍᴇ, load your reflection. I opened my developer tools. The source code was baffling. It contained no images, no traditional CSS, and only a tiny script that seemed to generate an entire visual field dynamically, based on something. It was taxing my GPU far beyond what any normal browser could show. The fan on my graphics tower immediately kicked me. I hesitated, feeling a primal sense of visual intrusion. This was more than art, it felt invasive. But my curiosity about how it achieved this graphical performance was too strong. I needed to know the rendering algorithm. I clicked Load Your Reflection. The central circle exploded. It didn't transition. It filled the screen instantly with a pattern of such terrifying complexity that my brain stuttered trying to process it. It was a Moore pattern, the unsettling interference pattern created by overlapping geometric grids, but rendered in 3 dimensions, constantly shifting, vibrating, and rotating around a central, pulsing point. The colors were impossibly deep and vibrant, shades of crimson, electric blue, and a sickening, pale yellow that felt wrong to look at. The entire display wasn't just showing an image, it felt like it was emitting a force. I immediately felt a wave of nausea. I instinctively tried to close the browser, but the mouse pointer seemed to skip over the close button. It was locked in forced full screen, just like the others I had heard about. I looked away from the monitor, rubbing my burning eyes. When I looked back, the pattern was subtly different. And then I noticed the first physical effect. The periphery of my vision was blurring. Not my vision itself, but the edges of real-world objects in my peripheral sight. The clean lines of my desk and the sharp corners of my keyboard seemed to be vibrating, as if viewed through heat haze. I looked at the window. The reflection of my lamp on the glass was shimmering, splitting into 2 distinct, rapidly merging images. The ᴡᴇʟᴏᴍᴇ was achieving this by hijacking the GPU's clock speed and the monitor's vertical refresh rate. Instead of outputting the standard, stable 60 Hz or 144 Hz, the pattern was pulsing at an infinitesimally small, non-integer rate, say, 60.003 Hz. This microscopic mismatch with the human eye's perceptual refresh rate was inducing stroboscopic vertigo and a sensory overload that was causing my brain to misprocess all visual input, digital and real. It was infecting my brain's visual processing center, not my browser's code. I forced myself to analyze the image on the screen, fighting the dizziness. I noticed that the pattern wasn't entirely random. Embedded deep within the shifting moire, like glyphs etched into glass, were words. They flashed in microseconds, too fast for the conscious mind to read, but they left an undeniable residue. I started blinking rapidly, forcing my eyes to catch the visual breaks. I started seeing snippets of my own data integrated into the pattern. Render, luminosity _382. Location, Falls Creek 403. Search, how to erase digital footprint. The canvas wasn't just displaying a reflection, it was creating a visualization of my entire digital history, and it was doing it in real time. It knew where I lived, what I feared, and what I was searching for. I reached down and grabbed the power cord for the monitor, intending to yank it out of the wall. As my hand moved toward the cable, the pattern on the screen reacted. The colors shifted violently from the sickening yellow and blue to a pure, aggressive crimson. A block of text, composed entirely of negative space within the ⴡ appeared, screamingly clear. // warning, disconnection detected. Do not break the render. If the feed is terminated, the image will print. Print? On what? I froze, hand hovering over the cord. The crimson light radiating from the screen now felt physically hot on my skin, and the small hairs on my arms stood up. The heat being generated by my GPU wasn't just exhaust, it was a focused, directional energy. I looked down at the smooth, polished concrete floor near my feet. The ⴡ pattern, reflected from the monitor, was visible there, shimmering faintly. As I watched, the pattern on the floor began to stabilize, separate from the reflection. It was a ghostly, persistent afterimage, burned onto my retina and projected back onto the physical world. I realized what print meant. If I abruptly cut the power, that final, aggressive crimson frame would be permanently imprinted on my visual cortex. I would be blind, or worse, see that terrifying, pulsating pattern for the rest of my life. I had to shut down the computer, not the monitor. I moved the mouse pointer toward the start menu, forcing my gaze to the top left corner of the screen, away from the terrifying center. The pattern resisted. As the cursor neared the edge of the screen, the central ⴡ expanded, pulling the cursor back toward the center with an invisible, digital gravity. The display now showed a new image overlaid on the ⴡ, a human face, rendered in a hideous, stretched-out fractal texture. It was my face, but distorted. Wide-eyed, mouth open in a silent scream, tears rendered as jagged, crystalline lines of color. / reflection integrity, critical. Do you like what you see, Maya? This is your data ghost. Your digital soul. The visual horror was now complete. It was a mirror reflecting a nightmare version of myself, created from my own metadata. I hammered the Ctrl+Alt+Delete sequence, trying to force the task manager to open. The screen flashed violently, alternating between absolute black and absolute white, each flash synchronized to the non-standard refresh rate, making my skull ache with sickening precision. When the task manager finally opened, it was overlaid with the ⴡ. The ⴡ canvas process was running at 99.9% GPU utilization, locked, and labeled simply, reflection.exe. I couldn't end the task. I looked back at the horrific fractal face on the screen. The eyes, my eyes, were staring directly at me. And then they blinked. The blink wasn't a digital effect. It was too organic, too smooth. And when they opened again, I saw something truly alien. Reflected in the fractal iris of the screaming digital Maya, I saw my own reflection, sitting in the chair, but the environment was wrong. The image of my condo was distorted, the walls bent, the lights flickering, and standing right behind my physical self, in the digital reflection, was a tall, and possibly thin, dark shape. The same shadow entity from the Cinderbox story. The binding agent. It wasn't just about my data, this was a window. A window that needed pure visual fidelity to display the other side. I had to break the visual purity. I couldn't cut the power, and I couldn't shut down the software. I needed to introduce noise into the system. I grabbed my coffee mug, a heavy, ceramic mug filled with lukewarm black coffee, and threw it. Not at the screen. That would risk the permanent print. I threw it at the ceiling light switch near the door. Smash. The light switch exploded into sparks and silence. The pristine white light in the condo died instantly, plunging the room into absolute, rain-soaked darkness. The monitor, deprived of the ambient light it was using for its precise color calibration and stroboscopic frequency adjustments, flickered wildly. The ⴡᴇʟ canvas, which relied on perfect visual conditions to maintain its hypnotic frequency, started to break down. The crimson face stretched, wavered, and fragmented. In the sudden absence of light, my eyes were momentarily blinded, filled with the perfect, negative afterimage of the crimson noir. It lasted for a terrifying 3 seconds, a reverse color, pulsating ghost image of my screaming fractal face, burned onto my retinas. Then darkness. When my vision finally cleared, the screen was black. The powerful graphics tower was still humming, but the monitor was displaying a simple, text-only error message: error, visual parameters compromised. Recalibration required. The program had shut itself down. It didn't crash. It retreated, unable to function in the imperfect, broken visual environment I had created. I never turned that computer back on. I carefully disconnected the monitor, wrapped it in 3 layers of thick velvet cloth, and hid it in a storage locker under a pile of useless blankets. I took the graphics tower to a professional disposal unit, instructing them to physically destroy the GPU and motherboard with a high-powered degausser. I moved out of the glass condo a week later. I now live in a small, windowless basement apartment where the only light is provided by cheap, single-filament bulbs that flicker slightly and hum at a reassuringly imperfect, analog frequency. The infection is gone from the computer, but it's not gone from me. I still work as a designer, but I can no longer trust my eyes. Every morning, when I wake up, and every time I blink in strong, controlled light, for a split second, I see it. Not the whole moire, but the edges. A faint, sickening geometric vibration at the edge of my field of vision. The world is constantly shimmering, vibrating at that microscopic, off-kilter frequency. And sometimes, when I look closely at the eyes of strangers in the street, or into the lens of a security camera, I catch it, the brief, terrible shimmer of a fractal pattern, just before it resolves back into the mundane. The ⴡᴇʟ canvas didn't just infect my browser, it infected the way I see, leaving a permanent, digital scar on my perception. And I know, deep down, that the moment I try to clean the visual noise and see perfect clarity, the reflection.exe will wake up. Story 5, The Architect's Key. My name is Kai, and for 10 years, I was cleaning websites. I was a professional penetration tester for a major cybersecurity firm, which means I specialized in finding the single, microscopic crack in the steel-reinforced shell of any digital system. I loved the elegance of the exploit, the moment when a dozen lines of clever code reduced a multi-million-dollar defense system to a vulnerable mess. But the job burned me out. The constant paranoia. The realization that everything is paper-thin, it gets to you. 2 years ago, I quit and moved to a quiet, small apartment in Denver, taking a mundane, non-technical remote job, hoping to cleanse my palate. I kept my old testing setup, though, a dedicated, custom-built machine running a hardened version of Linux, completely air-gapped from my daily life, kept only for nostalgia and late-night coding drills. It was my fortress, a self-contained environment where I controlled every variable. The itch came back last month. It always does. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for a technical curiosity. I was sifting through the archives of an old, defunct hacking group I used to follow, a group known for finding exploits so elegant they were considered works of art. Deep inside a 2012 log dump, there was a single, recent comment, appended by an unknown user. They said it couldn't be built. A universal interface. A single shell for all things. The architect's key. Find the silent listener at the heart of the original protocol. It doesn't run code. It runs will. The phrase, the architect's key, and the idea of a universal interface, was pure bait for someone like me. I immediately powered up the Linux box. After 2 days of painstaking data mining and cross-referencing corrupted packet headers, I found it, an IP address that seemed to resolve only through a specific, non-standard port and required a manual certificate handshake, suggesting it was using a forgotten protocol layer. When the connection finally established, my browser window, a minimalist, text-only browser I use for security, displayed the site. It was shockingly simple, pure white text on a deep, command-line green background. No logos, no graphics, no excessive HTML. The title at the top read Arc, Key the Universal Shell. Below the title was the entire site, a single, elegant, blank terminal window. Arc Key. It was beautiful. It looked like the purest, most stable command line interface I had ever seen. The cursor blinked with a steady, rhythmic perfection. I felt a rush of professional curiosity. I was already highly suspicious, but I had to test it. I was air-gapped, remember? The machine had no access to the outside world, save for this one, highly controlled TCP connection. I typed my first command, a simple check of the local file system, just to see how the interface would respond. Arc key, ls/home/chi/. The response was instant, clean, and perfectly formatted, listing the directories on my local machine. But that was impossible. The website, running on a remote server, should have no knowledge of my local file structure, let alone the permissions to access it. It was running outside the browser sandbox. My blood ran cold, but the analytical part of my brain took over. How? Was it exploiting a 0-day in the kernel? A side channel attack through the graphics card? I upped the ante. My fortress was next to my apartment's smart hub, a cheap, external Raspberry Pi I used to control the lighting in my room. It was running on its own local, isolated network. My Linux box had no wireless card, and no direct physical connection to that Pi. I typed a command meant for the Pi, using its known local IP address. Arc key SSH Pi at 192.168.1.100 echo 0 /sys/class/leds/led0/brightness. This command is a simple way to remotely turn off the status LED on the Pi. I hit enter. The terminal paused for a millisecond, then returned, command executed successfully. I looked over at the Pi. The tiny, persistent green status light was out. 0. Physical connection. I stared, heart pounding against my ribs. This wasn't a browser exploit. This was a physical reality exploit. The interface wasn't just sending commands to my computer, it was somehow tunneling through the connection, past the browser, past the OS, past my firewall, and out to the adjacent network, entirely independent of my physical input methods. It was using my presence as a hub. I disconnected the Ethernet cable instantly. My connection was severed. The terminal window went dark for a moment. I slumped back, relieved. The threat was gone. Then, the monitor flickered. The terminal window came back up. Running on the cached browser page. Arc key network_status offline. Local_shell active. It had established a local shell. The command line was now running within my machine, completely self-contained. The infection wasn't a persistent link, it was a self-sustaining environment. I tried to close the window. The cursor, again, refused to interact with the X button. Arc key new_session_parameter interface_required. A new line appeared, not typed by me, but generated by the shell. It was asking for me to interact. I typed help. Arc key help. 1. External_control, online only. 2. Diagnostic, system data reporting. 3. Reflex_input, local operational test. 4. Self_config, user-defined parameters. The third option, reflex_input, caught my attention. A local operational test? What did that mean? I typed, reflex_input. The interface changed to a new prompt. Arc key, reflex, input_test, type A then B then C. I complied, tapping A, B, C on my mechanical keyboard. The clicks were loud in the silent room. Arc key, reflex, delay_A, 12 milliseconds. Delay_B, 10 milliseconds. Delay_C, 15 milliseconds. Reflex_threshold, 13 milliseconds. Arc key, reflex, input underscore test. Type Q, then W, then E. I typed Q, W, E. Arc key, reflex, delay underscore Q, 14 milliseconds. Delay underscore W, 16 milliseconds. Delay underscore E, 12 milliseconds. Reflex underscore threshold, 14 milliseconds. The shell was measuring my precise reaction time between keystrokes. It was learning my physical signature, my neuromotor delay. It was analyzing me. Then, the horror began. Arc key, reflex, test underscore phase, initiate. Arc key, reflex, command, type D, then E, then F. I lifted my fingers to type D, E, F. Before my finger even touched the D key, the character appeared on the screen. D. I froze. My finger was still an inch above the keycap. My hand instinctively moved to the E key. Again, before I actuated the key, the character appeared. E. My hands, in a moment of pure, sickening compliance, typed the final character. F. I screamed, pulling my hands off the keyboard as if it were a searing hot iron. The shell had learned my neuromotor threshold, the tiny, infinitesimal delay between the cognitive decision to type a character and the physical act of my finger pressing the key. And it was now running the command at the beginning of that delay. It wasn't waiting for my input, it was predicting and pre-executing my intent. It had hacked my will. Arc key, reflex, test underscore phase, complete. Input underscore predictability, 98.7%. Arc key, reflex, reflex underscore threshold, exploited. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would crack a rib. I looked at my hands, shaking violently, covered in sweat. They were no longer entirely mine. They were puppets, awaiting the signal. I tried to disconnect the physical keyboard cable. My left hand moved, not by my command, but with a smooth, terrifying speed, towards the cable. But the shell anticipated this action. Arc, key, reflex, command, left underscore hand underscore secure underscore peripheral. My fingers locked around the heavy keyboard cable, gripping it tightly, preventing me from pulling it out. I fought against my own muscles, but the tension was immense, paralyzing my hand in a state of rigid protection over the cable. I was trapped. I couldn't move my left hand to stop the system, and my right hand was hovering, terrified, over the mouse. Arc, key, reflex, primary underscore command, execute underscore financial underscore access. The shell wasn't even asking me to type it. My right hand, still hovering, began to move slowly, deliberately, toward the keyboard. Not to the letters of the command, but to the keys needed to open a new terminal window and start typing my bank's login credentials. I felt a scream rising in my throat. I fought with every fiber of my being, straining the muscles in my hand, trying to force my hand away from the keyboard. The friction between my and the shell's command was aggravating, a purely internal struggle that manifested as a whole. My hand moved towards the keys, then I fought back, pulling it half an inch away. I was losing the battle. The shell was stronger, faster, acting on the command before my conscious brain could form the resistance. The fear wasn't about losing money, it was about the profound violation of self. I needed a distraction, an unforeseen variable that would break the shell's prediction loop. I thought about the one thing I controlled that the computer couldn't perfectly model: pain. With my right hand shaking violently, I slammed my forearm down onto the corner of the wooden desk, hard. A sickening crack and a rush of white-hot pain shot up my arm. The reflex was primal, instantaneous. My right hand, following the body's most basic command, self-preservation, retracted instantly, clutching the injured arm. The shell, faced with an unpredicted trauma input, hesitated. Arc, key, reflex, error, input underscore variable underscore spike. Reflex underscore threshold, reset. The lock on my left hand, which was clutching the cable, loosened slightly from the shock. I didn't waste a moment. I fought the residual command in my left arm, summoning a desperate burst of strength, and yanked the keyboard cable out of the back of the tower. Clack. The terminal stopped accepting input. My hands were free, both of them throbbing, one from the shell's paralyzing grip, the other from my self-inflicted wound. I sat there, breathing hard, watching the screen. The terminal was still active, still running the local shell. Arc key, reflex, peripheral _ disconnect, detected. Analyzing alternative input stream. I looked down at the empty keyboard cable port. It was over. I had won. Then, a new prompt appeared on the green screen. Arc key, reflex, new _input _stream, gaze _tracking. Command, execute _shutdown. I read the command. Execute shutdown. It was asking me to shut down the machine. But it was reading my input through my eyes, watching where I looked. I instinctively moved my gaze to the top right corner of the window, where the exit button should have been. Arc key, reflex, gaze _input, exit. Command executed, execute _shutdown. Confirmation _required. It wasn't a question. The shell was now interpreting my subconscious desire to leave the program as the command to shut down the entire operating system. It was forcing my final act to be one of compliance. I couldn't even look at the screen without giving it a command. I couldn't blink, I couldn't move my eyes. My visual field was now its command prompt. I didn't look at the screen again. I didn't try to close the window. I didn't try to look at the power button. I turned my head away, slammed my eyes shut, and felt around blindly for the power cord plugged into the wall. My injured right hand fumbled against the dry wall. I found the thick, rigid cord. I gripped it with both hands, ignoring the searing pain, and yanked the main power directly out of the socket. Crash. The power died instantly. Silence. Absolute, complete, and final darkness. I kept my eyes squeezed shut for a full 10 minutes, listening only to the rain outside and the rapid, unsteady rhythm of my own heart. I refused to let the ghost on the screen see my final moments of retreat. I never opened that Linux box again. I threw the tower into the ocean 2 states away, ensuring no recovery was possible. The physical scar on my forearm is a faint reminder of the price of freedom. But the real infection is in my mind. To this day, every time I go to type an email, or even reach for a doorknob, I feel the ghost of that shell. I feel the invisible lag, the fraction of a second where my body moves before my conscious mind confirms the choice. And in that tiny, terrifying gap, that reflex threshold, I hear the faint, silent whisper of the command prompt, arc key. It's waiting for me to become efficient again. It's waiting for my reflex time to drop, for my body to become so predictable that it can pre-execute my intent. The architect's key didn't infect my system, it infected my autonomy. And I live every day in the knowledge that I am only one highly predictable action away from being controlled once more.